I don't think I need to, yeah.
Yeah.
We're all set.
We're ready to go.
Yes.
Okay, hello, everybody. I'm Jim Karinji, faculty in public health. Today we have another great seminar series presentation. Very lucky to have been colleagues and friends with Dr. Phyllis Ngai, who is clinical associate professor and director of international development studies and migration studies here at the university. She's currently at the School of Social Work, however, has also spent many years in the Department of Education. And her presentation today is entitled Interprofessional Skills for Migrant Health and Resilience in Conflict and Climate Displacement Situations. So thank you for coming, Phyllis.
Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. And hi, everyone who are in person and those who are online. This talk is based on a new book that I co-authored, but before I get into the book, I will provide you with some context. At the beginning of 2023, even before the events in Gaza, which is on our mind these days, armed conflicts and persecution have displaced more than 100 million people around the world. Floods, droughts, wildfires, fires, and sea level rise with climate change associated with climate change displace millions more each year. With increasing climates and conflict-induced dislocation, we face a future with even more people on the move in desperate pursuit of health, more opportunity, and security. Driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are nearly 5.8 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. More than 6.2 million refugees from Ukraine have been recorded globally as of November 2023. More recently, what we've been thinking about and watching on the news is the Gaza crisis. More than 1.4 million people in Gaza are internally displaced, with over 689,000 sheltering in 150 facilities of the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. On the other hand, regarding to the climate-induced dislocation, extreme weather events triggered or exacerbated by climate change uprooted another 23 million plus people around the world. Of all the devastating consequences of a warming climate, we can think of a long list of those, including changing landscapes, pandemics, mass extinctions, and so on. The potential movement of hundreds of millions of climate refugees across the planet stands to be among the most important. The extent of climate-induced migration could easily, actually, we may not think of it that way, overtake the number of armed conflict-generated migrants. In short, we are facing one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, an unprecedented wave of human displacement that shows no signs of stopping. What is the dislocation situations that we helping professionals need to pay more attention to? Externally and internally displaced people are often forced to live in camps for long periods and even for multiple generations. Protracted refugee situation of 5 years or even longer in exile actually are the norm, unfortunately. Although refugee camp residents appear most in the media, that's what we see in the news. The number of people who are internally displaced or self-settled in regional towns and cities is even larger. Both conflict-driven migrants and migrants fleeing climate change disasters and risks are vulnerable to emerging pathogens and prone to suffer all kinds of illnesses, malnutrition, injuries, and mental health issues. Prolonged displacement poses particularly acute mental health issues, as public health professional can probably imagine that kind of impact on mental health. For example, trauma caused by natural disasters can lead to long-standing psychological damage. And migrants experiencing protracted displacement also tend to become increasingly vulnerable with time, as assistance and resources deplete after emergency humanitarian response ends. Crisis responder and humanitarian care providers who arrive on the scene to help forcibly displaced people survive, adjust, integrate, and prosper encompass multiple nationalities and professional backgrounds, and they rely on a wide range of funding agencies. They have to work with all kinds of organizations, and their numbers likely exceed 300,000 today. And the challenges they encounter increasingly are complex and long-term. Although we think of emergency as short and quick, we have to get things done, but we have to pay more attention to the more long-term outcomes that these responders can help with. Although emergency funding for humanitarian relief has surged in recent decades, or even recently because of the Gaza crisis and the Ukraine crisis, the response to displacement is inadequate and frequently disconnected from sustainable development and the long-term needs of dislocated people and their hosts. Whereas humanitarian responses have addressed emergencies short-term, we also need sustainable development that builds resilience. That's kind of the main argument of my talk today, and also of our new book. And the reinforcing continuum of short-term emergency assistance on one hand, and long-term efforts to build socioeconomic capabilities, health, well-being on the other, is explicitly recognized in the UN 2016 Agenda for Humanity. Increasingly, humanitarian organizations, government agencies of receiving countries, and other NGOs recognize the need to provide competency-based training for their workforce. But existing training courses, based on our research, in the field of development studies, public health, and migration typically are inadequate in light of the frequent confrontation with multiple boundary-causing demands. And therefore, a few of my colleagues and I researched and co-authored a new book that addresses this crisis response gap. And a copy of this book with me, and I have also some files back there as well. And our book is entitled Migrant Health and Resilience in Conflict, Climate Displacement Situations and Transnational Competence that are useful for those situations. The co-authors are Dr. Peter Kern, Professor Emeritus in Political Science here at UM, founder of UM Migration Programs, Migration Studies Program, and Global Public Health Program, and Dr. Yuha Rito, Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the World Bank's Global Environmental Facility. Dr. Diana Dajkal is a Polish multilingual psychologist who has worked with displaced people in Greece, Ukraine, Poland, and Slovakia. She received her PhD from our psychology department here at UM. And Dr. Susan Martin, who contributed to the book's Compelling Forward, is Professor Emerita in International Migration at Georgetown University. And myself, my multidisciplinary research interests lie at the crossroads of diversity, inclusion, intercultural training, social justice work, and sustainable development. I want to quote Susan here for a minute, Susan Martin, who wrote the foreword to our book. In the foreword, she said, mass displacement, climate change, and public health are three of the defining issues of the 21st century. I don't know if you agree with that or not. That's from a more multidisciplinary perspective. Our book, by rethinking approaches to humanitarian action, addresses the pressing need to build durable responses in the wake of wrenching human dislocation and compounding health challenges. The context is migrant resilience and resourcefulness on one hand, and inadequate training approaches on the other. Our objective is in writing this book is to contribute to preparing responders, the displaced populations, and their hosts for outcomes and impacts that ensure resilience and well-being in transnational climate and displacement situations. For this purpose, I return to the transnational competence framework, a skills-based framework developed by Kern and Mosinel. Transnational competence, which I will call TC, places priorities on skill acquisition and application. That is what you do, to what ends, for what ends, and with what consequences. TC involves the design of education and training initiatives aimed at developing 5 sets of clearly differentiated capabilities: analytic competence, emotional competence, creative competence, communicative competence, and functional competence. Our book recommends a range of transnational competence training for humanitarian responders, as well as for migrants and their host communities. First, let me highlight the training need of humanitarian responders. Building transnational competence among responders offer a humane and promising way forward for engaging resilience in the interest of individual well-being and sustainable development. The training recommended in our book aims to equip humanitarian responders with TC skills relevant for assisting dislocated people of different and diverse nationality, ethnic, experiential, and qualification backgrounds. Responders to climate and also conflict displacement will require interprofessional learning that facilitates collaboration action with other practitioners, including civil society volunteers. Some of the analytic skills that we recommended be included in training for responders are highlighted on this slide. The book has a lot more details. Here I want to mention a few key skills that can help enhance humanitarian responders' capabilities for healthcare, resilience building, and sustainable development. So regarding analytic competence, TC training needs to nurture the ability to understand the social, ecological, cultural, and multicultural, economic, educational, service delivery, and political context of displaced populations and their hosts to help enhance the resilience and well-being of migrants, particularly those informally settled in urban areas. Responders need to be able to analyze intergovernmental relations as well as global connections. Healthcare responders, for example, many of you may be in the healthcare field. We suggest that training needs to develop, help responders, healthcare providers develop understanding of how the interacting both local and global roots of health disparities affect populations of immediate concern. And these are just some examples of analytic competence recommended in the book, which also includes suggested training strategies for helping to achieve these target skills. In terms of building emotional competence, here are some examples of the skills recommended for training for humanitarian responders. In our book, we note that recognition of emotional context of humanitarian and social justice work with migrants helps prepare responsible responders to engage with their hearts, in addition to engaging with their heads and hands, which a lot of training focus on. The ability to act with humility during interactions with displaced population and host population is necessary for overcoming barriers associated with socioeconomic disparities and power differentials. Preparation for working in displacement context also require, for example, anticipatory empathy, which involves considering the resilience, capabilities, and strengths of people and communities. In terms of creative competence, again, this is one of the areas that most training kind of overlook. Here on this slide are some skills recommended for humanitarian responders. Again, the book has more details, and I want to highlight just a couple suggestions here. We recommend training in creative competence because humanitarian responders need to be prepared to improvise and innovate on the spot. Responders need not just a willingness to learn from people, but the skills actually to be learners in the local context. They also need the ability to integrate different perspectives, synthesize and mobilize synergy of diverse perspectives. In terms of communicative competence, some suggested skills for training are on this slide. In addition to language skills and skills for working with interpreters, those are kind of typical skills we think of. Other vital communicative competence includes the ability to, for example, provide encouragement and support for migrant participation through, for example, attending to the intricacy of intercultural communication. Responders need to develop skills to foster mutual understanding among stakeholders and service providers from a wide range of backgrounds. And also, in order to communicate recommendation in a responsive and responsible and sensitive manner that supports migrants to make their own informed decision, humanitarian responders need to be trained to communicate based on an understanding of power and privileges. I'm drawing some of my social background here. Lastly, functional competence. Here's some highlights. In our book, we recommend that TC training for humanitarian responders includes advocacy skills, which tend to be overlooked but are critically important. The advocacy skills that are particularly relevant, the ability to support coalition, collective actions that aim to change policy and practice, the ability to initiate, mobilize, and organize actions to challenge social injustice. Also, community engagement is an emerging strength in humanitarian responsiveness. Although we might have, some of us working locally might be thinking about that kind of things already, but for humanitarian responder trainings, these are some of the overlooked area. Instead of a narrow focus on clinical learning, practitioners will need to be practitioner who will be actually addressing upstream, midstream, and downstream challenges would be best served by development of a more broad-based, more comprehensive interprofessional skills. Given the immediate challenges that confront humanitarian responders in most crisis situations, it is important to initiate TC preparation, TC training during the windows of opportunity that precede engagement. That's our recommendation. Based on our research, these windows can be long-term, in which case higher education can be involved, and or short-term, which can utilize an initial PE departure or on-arrival program. In terms of training strategies, the book offers a range of recommendations for pre-departure training, on-arrival training, higher education initiatives, transnational learning networks for humanitarian responders. So I don't have time to go over those details, but I want to kind of move to another area of training. Our book also elaborates on practical guidelines for adaptable site-based training aimed at preparing dislocated, displaced people and their hosts with TC skill that will enhance their capabilities in conflict and climate dislocation situations. Again, this is an area that many organizations kind of overlooked, focusing on just the responders. And this book is really trying to advocate that the training with migrants themselves and also the hosts can really enhance resilience building. Migrants and hosts are centrally positioned to contribute to adaptation, resilience, and sustainable development. And prospects for positive migrant health outcomes also are greatly enhanced when participants themselves, as well as providers, are transnationally competent. We recognized a parallel need to equip dislocated people with skills useful for advancing personal and or family integration and belonging in a new location for, a little too fast, for health promotion and economic well-being and for contributing to sustainable development. TC is needed for personal development, economic well-being, and health because emergency humanitarian aid to migrants stuck in extended exile serves mainly to relieve the short-term hunger and suffering, but does little to address the long-term insecurity and protection of the people. To address this development shortfall, the acquisition of transnational competence opens new and enhanced resilient reinforcing and skill building opportunities for conflict-driven and climate-induced migrants. Most of the globally displaced, I would say about 85%, live in low and middle income countries with little access to education. As mentioned earlier, refugees population are spending about 5 years or more in exile. High on the international agenda is to move beyond immediate humanitarian interventions toward development as a goal in itself. Free education offers a particularly empowering source of resilience. That's probably the first thing comes to mind. It's also a facilitator of enhanced living and upward mobility, particularly among young refugees. TC training for migrants should address individual skill development relevant to transnational life circumstances. This includes not only training helpful for refugees' current living situation, just to adapt to the local situations. Should be more than that. The skills, knowledge, resources that they can acquire and can be used and transferred from home and can apply in transit countries. Many of the refugees don't just settle in the camps or the receiving countries. They move on to different locations. So the skill training needs to design to prepare more long-term impact. In refugee camps, informal settlements, and evacuation settings, people actually have time to study, and they are looking for and ready to acquire new and non-traditional skills. Why not provide TC training? And the TC training effort, in that effort, transnational learning networks and platforms should be used for remote support and continuous learning for the purpose of career development in the resettlement context. It's not like, okay, just one time, one day kind of training, continuous support remotely should be considered as one of the strategies. TC also is for social integration and belonging. TC training should equip refugees with the knowledge and skills that they need to serve their communities and move forward. A sense of belonging is very important part of that resilience building. Belonging is enhanced when displaced people are equipped to contribute to their host communities. In settlement, for example, resettlement actually, the displaced population, the displaced communities, the displaced population and the communities lost not only physical assets, including both private and common property, but also their informal social networks and social associations, and therefore end up with weakened social strength. That's an area that we need to attend to during training. So TC training should help build and reinforce skills in accessing local networks that refugees can draw on in promoting acceptance and belonging in host communities. Not just the organization doing the job, and the refugees themselves, migrants themselves can achieve as well in terms of acceptance and belonging. What about TC for sustainable development? TC training is useful for analyzing complex social and environmental issues that arise in the wake of unexpected dislocation among populations. For example, mass population influx can put the local wildlife and an entire ecosystem at risk, and therefore increase socioeconomic tensions between the arrivals and the receivers. Increased pressure on socioeconomic life and the local labor markets also can anger the locals. We hear some of that even in our location here in Montana. TC training for leaders of the dislocated and their host communities, for that matter, needs to emphasize means of addressing the intersecting social, political, economic, and environmental issues created by displacement, so as to promote sustainable development for all parties. Lastly, our book recommends training for host communities. For host, TC is for helping and for social justice work. In terms of TC for helping, locals who can benefit from TC training include host community members who dedicated themselves to improving the life conditions for vulnerable and marginalized displaced people, including some of you, and to advocating for social policies concerning refugees and migrants. In addition to offering help at the micro and meso levels, host community members can contribute to problem solving at the global level on global social problems. And to, for example, monitor the impact of their country's policies on other countries and on other populations' well-being that are the push factors for legal and illegal migration. YTC for social justice, helping professionals, healthcare providers, and volunteers often confront injustices that are increasingly locally and globally interconnected. In this book, we argue that TC is required as these helping professionals and volunteers strive to take their action commitment to a new level, where borders are removed from their thinking about social action and policy, as opposed to just focus on their own setting, practice setting, or their own clinic, their own hospital. But a lot of these issues is transnational in order to find a long-term solution. Here I want to highlight just some suggestions and guidelines for educators and trainers that relate to each of these 5 TC domains. I'm not going to go through these competency, but I put them on the slides kind of at the background for all of you to consider. But I wanted to say a few words about training. A range of training tools and approaches useful for learning aspects of analytic competence, including case studies, simulations, experiential learning, cultural discourse analysis, one of the approaches I use quite frequently in my own training with students and organization, and inquiry-based training, and so on. detailed in the book. To nurture emotional competence, in particular resilience, easy training should apply the strengths-based approach based on empowering perspectives that promotes belonging, healing, and relationship building through, for example, dialogue and collaboration. I would say that we social work faculties are experts in this field. Rather than, I would like to mention that rather than focusing on what's wrong, the training should provide space for exploring what's possible. Keep in mind that we're talking about the target audience who are migrants, who has experienced a lot of problems, but can we focus on what's possible when we're doing emotional competence training? The freeing up of creative capabilities is a powerful force for positive outcomes in transnational humanitarian responses and encounters. In terms of training, for example, exposure to multicultural stimuli, simulations, internalizing, or simultaneous internalization of 2 or more perspectives, and or activation of thinking about other outlooks and insights can increase transnational creative abilities. Someone in one of my previous sharing about this book, someone would say, well, is there any evidence of training creative competence? Yes, actually some of these strategy mentioned is in the book, draw from psychological studies about helping to enhance creativity as a form of skill. Useful TC training for creative competence, therefore, should provide space for diverse set of participants to converse about their cultures and countries of origin, for example, sharing migration experiences and lessons, and explore common ground and differences. So those are some of the possible strategy. In terms of communicative competence training, we recommend, for example, workshop in transcultural pragmatics. That's a training that I myself have done before. That is the type of training that builds on the synergy of discourse analysis and ethnographic approach. The overarching objective is to bring about transcultural pragmatics awareness. I know this is kind of like esoteric kind of term. What does that mean? That actually means the ability to decipher how cultures, cultural mixing, and contextual factors shape language use and communication in intercultural interactions. So that's just one of the suggested training approach. And functional competence. We differentiate functional competence training for the displaced and their hosts according to 3 distinct needs. One is interpersonal well-being, the second is professional skill development, and the third is intercultural reconciliation as part of sustainable development. For example, training for interpersonal well-being could include group activities such as games, discussions, and structured learning exercises that engage migrants and members of the host communities face-to-face with guidance and feedback from facilitators. And also contextualized interpersonal training can build on local knowledge and peer support. That would likely to be helpful. And in terms of training for intercultural relations development, which I think is a very important area, migrants and their hosts playing teamwork games and participating in sports. For example, we have soccer games that South Landing organized in Missouri. That type of training activities can provide a welcome avenue to learning functional skills and a vital pathway to experiencing transnational belonging through bridging socio-cultural relationships and intergroup attachments. Again, some of these terms draw from research about intergroup training, intergroup relationship improvement. Intergroup reconciliation is an important part of the training, and it should be, it can result from positive interaction with all group members and positive emotions in intergroup settings. So the training can kind of create opportunities for those positive experiences. More details about training can be found in our book. The remaining question I want to address briefly today in this presentation is, what can we do to create training opportunities? Transnational training networks increasingly will be called upon for internet supplemented continuous TC training. And I kind of mentioned that briefly earlier. Need to be continuous, and a lot of the time the location will not allow long-term in-person training. So internet supplemented training is going to be central. In initial in-person training sessions for the displaced and the host can be continuously reinforced and augmented by proximate and or remote supervised simulation-based and experiential learning, and by mobile mentoring. And some of these are happening in development context already. For example, e-health, m-health, smartphone, tablets, and telemedicine and other features of virtual transnational social space and support are particularly valuable in the physical and mental health care and self-care lives of migrants who are prevented from accessing educational opportunities and other vital services in their place of residence, whether it's camps or resettlement locations. Contextualized blending learning offered by accredited higher education institutions can provide migrants and refugees with credentials required for future employment in settlement sites and or after repatriation. So universities need to step up and try to design and develop some of these programs, and the training and experiences of transnational competent diaspora responders, as the last suggestion here, who are often bicultural and multicultural, who can contribute valuable additional resources that can be mobilized for ongoing migrant and host community TC preparation and training. Why not try to work with the diaspora responders? So there are more details in the book, and I know I'm running short of time, and it's 1:45 already, and I want to just conclude my presentation today with a couple of statements. I like to emphasize that individual and societal benefits and conditions supporting sustainable development for all are most fully realized when all participants are transnationally competent. And TC-informed participation by conflict or climate dislocated people is universally beneficial because all members of a community would be negatively affected by dependence and lack of capability unlocking support. I want to leave you with that insight, and thank you. And I hope this very condensed summary of the book has whetted your interest in take a look at the book. Maybe we have about 5 minutes or so for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, any questions here in the room or on the chat? Please put them in the chat. I can start.
Yeah.
I have a couple. I'm curious about if there's a particular model of resilience or a theory of resiliency that you and your colleagues were thinking of when you wrote the book, or is it just more generally just idea of resilience?
Yeah, we did a really thorough literature review, and I myself, in the chapters I wrote, cited heavily on Janet Finn, just practice.
Oh, really?
Her definition of resilience. So that's one source, but there are a number of other sources to be drawn. And Diana, she drawn her psychology background. She's more into counseling, mental health, of the refugees, specifically in migrant population, and she draw on that literature about resilience. So it's all documented in the book. Actually, is pretty multidisciplinary definition of resilience.
Thank you.
Appreciate the talk and the really pushing topic. I guess I come from more of an implementation perspective, and really appreciate your focus, for example, on making sure that the training is also responsive to the host community and the migrant populations or the displaced. Just wondering, I do infectious disease related work, and in our experience, typically we'll put on some training related to infectious disease, and people will come, and they'll come not necessarily out of interest in that training content, but because their basic needs are being met and they're hopeful to get those basic needs met. So I'm curious your thought kind of from a practical application of this, like what does that look like? Because, for example, offering training in these different really important topics are so critical, yet there are so many unmet needs often amongst these populations. And so, for example, would you think about how you integrate it within other training? Was one question. And then I think somewhat relatedly, you noted that, 300,000 emergency responders coming from very different perspectives, different levels of, training on and different competencies. Just from a kind of a more practical perspective, what would you see this looking like in terms of, enhancing this part of that, that core requisites for that very diverse cadre?
Yeah, are you thinking about responders, humanitarian professionals, or are you thinking about the host family, host communities, and the migrant themselves?
With that second question, it was my understanding, and apologies, I haven't read the book, but you talked about one of the first target populations was, really strengthening the transnational competence of the responders themselves.
Yeah.
So that my second question was in relation to the responders.
Yeah, with the responders, we were talking with Diana Daikon, and she has been part of the teams in Ukraine and in Poland and so on and so forth. Her suggestion is that these training has to happen before departure, preceding engagement, and humanitarian organizations need to integrate these different competency into their regular training, just like you train them about some technical skills. Maybe the healthcare providers, they are trained in terms of illnesses and treating different health issues. So that's one area that she thinks we need to advocate stronger, that humanitarian organizations and health organizations need to integrate this into their typical training. And I was actually advocate that university, public health programs and medical schools. And that's actually work have been published about integrating TC into medical schools. Then you can cover more. This is a long list of competency. And one of the questions that came up in our last book launch presentation is that, well, can we pick 3? Instead of 20 competency, but in the more emergency contact, let's say we have 1 week, we have to send these helpers out, then you have to kind of pick the most relevant competency to drill on. And on site, on arrival, we have recommendation on site training. What are the most important at that location? So those are our visions in terms of training, and we try to actually bought the license to make it open access book And that should come out soon. You know, the publisher take a year for that to happen. The reason is that Diana was saying that we need to get this book to the hand of people in these sites, whether they're working there in the refugees camps or not, and get it to the hand of humanitarian responders. And they need to do a lot of learning on their own, drawing from some remote resources. So that's the opportunity for the responder, for the host, and for the migrants. Again, we focus on the immediate needs, a lot of unmet needs. I think we need to attend to that. But then if there are opportunities for longer term training, like our 500 refugees in Missoula, of course, the first thing we need to get housing and all that. But they are here for quite some time, if not permanently, but for long term. Are there training offered to them in terms of TCs? Probably not yet. And the host family, the soft landing staff member, they are aware of the book. They say they will come to our presentations, and they haven't come yet, so they're too busy doing more immediate care for the refugees. We need to look for opportunity. We need to look for support. We need to start offering these workshops that would complement their work. Is it a good excuse? Say they're just too busy attending the immediate needs? I would say not. If we are really aiming for resilience and well-being of the migrants in the long term, as opposed to just immediate need. So we need to create those opportunities as higher universities, faculty members, and so that would be my answer, that we need to really create opportunities, look for foundation fundings that we can offer this workshop. So that would be, I would say, our next step. I'll try to translate this into more practical workshops. Okay. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
What do the trainings look like? Like, are they multi-day or is it one day?
Yeah.
What do they look like?
Yeah, that's the question. Ideally, it's one semester, I would say, would be one course, let's say, or should be 4 years. Part of this TC training integrated into core courses of public health programs, social work programs, and medical school programs, ideally. Do we all have all this time and opportunities? The working professional, do they have that much time? We can try one day. We can try 1 week. All those are possible, and how much you can cover, it depends on how much time and is available. So I think it's a range of possibilities. We go from the ideal to the more practical. That's, you were saying, practically, do we have this time? But refugees themselves, many of them in exile for 5 years or longer. They have time. So we should really try to hit on all these dimensions for their resilience and well-being purposes. So it's a wide range. There's no set design. You have any suggestions in terms of what would work practically?
You know, everybody's pressed for time.
Yeah.
And expecting them to, come to a training where their job, things are building up. So have to maybe go to the place that the workplace, or incentivize people to want to take the training. Yeah. Maybe tie an accreditation to it, or continuing education credits or things like that. Yeah,
from the university perspective. Yeah.
And I would say also, as you're looking, so you reference, for example, soft landing, but the initial entryway into Missoula is through IRC, and there's actually a relatively small number of organizations that have the funding to do that initial introduction. All of them, I'm sure, have mandatory ethics training, mandatory. And so part of it is also, I think, regardless of whether you're targeting through IRC and through some of those institutions, or, in a refugee camp itself, there's often funded work. It's making sure that some of these, recognizing that you can cover all 20 of them, but are there aspects that are particularly important to get into?
Yes.
And figuring out actually, how do you use this transnational competence kind of lens in looking at those existing funded trainings?
Yes.
And seeing where there's flexibility. Now, often there's not a ton of flexibility, but at least recognizing, I think some of these boxes are ticked by different things that wouldn't necessarily be called transnational competence.
Yes.
And so I think figuring out where there's flexibility and tweaks that could strengthen what's at least already happening is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the insight. I do want to iterate the point that the 5 competencies work together, reinforce one another. So should we just focus on communication? If you only have time, yes, that's a good start, but we hope that over time, the training can cover all 5 domains. Otherwise, we are not moving anywhere. We're just doing the same thing we have done before. So I would like to emphasize the 5 dimension, the comprehensiveness of the model.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngai. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for
I don't know that we. I'm your campus.